uh, it is a profession rooted in patience. That if you think about the time that it takes to gain a commission, to come up with an idea and oversee that idea through development, await the economy to gain the right budgets for it and implement it. Let's say it can be as short as a couple of years, but as long as 10 years, sometimes even longer, to build a project. So there's certainly one life cycle that takes that long. And just to put it in let's say career years, it's vastly different to win a competition in your 30s and then oversee its completion in your 40s, or dare I say in your 80s, awaiting your death and to have it built posthumously. At the same time, it's worth pondering the idea that we don't just design buildings. We design ideas, and we iterate those ideas from one project to another. So in fact, we're constantly working through certain intellectual projects, and it doesn't really matter how they're materialized. Sometimes it's through a model, other times it's through a drawing, and then it finds itself being built as a detail of a house, but it eventually finds itself in a larger institutional building. And you're not doing this just once. You're doing it through material studies. You're doing it through spatial and organizational tropes. You're doing it through fusing programming strategies. There's a lot of techniques that you're working on. So ideas aren't even that necessarily unique to one project, but that they're migrating from sometimes centuries into your preoccupations. And just to put a cap on my response, the lecture that I'm working on right now is called Timely Anachronisms, which is really an appeal to that patience, that we are not really solving in these buildings. We're not solving a problem for here and now, but we're building a conversation for a dialogue that we're having with an architect that was born a century or two before us, or has yet to be born a century from now. So that there is a kind of longue durée that we're interested in sometimes. And maybe that time that it takes to do these things is not even in our time. It's for another time. But I still think that that's very valid and probably more potent if you see the profession that way, or if you see the discipline that way.
I'm wondering whether, in kind of psychoanalytic terms, there is an issue in that, in the fact that we don't exercise maybe the urge sometimes in a lifetime.
I'm not sure if I have a response for that. It has more to do with how you deal with the anxiety of the here and now, and I guess that some of us maybe release the kind of the anxieties of productivity that need immediate rewards through cooking and through other things.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, or you leave architecture.
Yeah.
Because but also it's not just the time. I'm sorry. It's it's the voices, the collaborations, the mediations, and the losses that come along the way. I mean, uh, I think time is the least of our anxieties. It is even more so the protagonists that you confront along that path. Uh, Many who are, of course, great supporters of a process, but many who are indeed provocative antagonists, uh, and overcoming those as much as working with them is part of a process whereby you depersonalize those challenges. So so I'm not sure if I've responded from the psychoanalytic perspective that you're
I
in.
think you have. So, yes. So, who are those antagonists that are greater than time?
Well, let's say to channel it through Harry Cobb and what he terms as the great predicament of architecture, it has to do with confronting uh, the profession first uh, in the binary terms he defines them, is that at once you have a Hippocratic oath to uh, represent the client, the mission, the social project, with a kind of genuine and earnest appeal to those things that serve them well. But on the other hand, a commitment to the discipline and the advancement of new forms of knowledge that are independent of the very uh, patronage that you're serving. And often these don't align well. Uh, a great architect can often bring these into confluence, but that's not a natural act. That's wizardry. And so, so recognizing this dual and parallel strand is one of them. The second, in other words, I'm basically saying that the client is the conduit of great opportunities, but also a huge possible struggle, a huge hurdle to overcome. The other, of course, is the construction industry, and that's where basically whatever work that we've done and whatever scholarship that I've written about has to do with overcoming different cultures, protocols of fabrication, what is termed in America as the means and methods of construction that has been taken away from architects from a legal perspective, handing us back only access to design intent, with the idea of how things are built relegated to the hands of the contractor and subcontractors. The overcoming of this schism is a huge battle, and it is and you can confront it in working closely with builders. You can also overcome it with battling the commissioning of the trades and doing design build yourself, or finding novel ways in which certain things become internal to the concept of a commission early on through the schematic design processes, so that you're able to deliver on them. But essentially, what you're seeing in the so-called advanced economies is a process of industrialization that has made architectural craft and ingenuity standardized, making for products that come with insurance, overcoming certain liabilities, but killing any idea of invention, which is why you can appreciate some of the kind of inventions that may be happening in the so-called developing economies, whether you term that in sort of in Mexico or in China or in Iran or otherwise. The idea that less institutionalized forms of construction practice are able to yield a higher engagement of developing new ideas, new products, new ways of building things for the projects, and using projects as a platform for invention. So these are just two examples, and of course other examples include things, processes that we call here in America design by committee, that when you're getting into larger projects, they don't hire you anymore. You have to team up with a planner on one side, an artist on the other side, a poet on that side, and community ringleaders that engage in social processes that make for an urban design project. None of this is a negative thing per se. You're bringing good voices into the process, but it also means you have to manage an incredible level of diversity of voices, and bringing integrity to an idea requires a higher level of diplomacy and conceptual ingenuity. So the public process in and of itself, the hurdles that you have to overcome are yet part of some of those challenges.
And what about architectural education? Is that a challenge as well?
I think architectural education is always a challenge, depending on how we term it. From my generation, there was such a thing as schools of thought. This is the pre-internet era, and so as much as you gain from that education, as much as that education indoctrinated certain things that ironically were limiting. Your generation, and I'm making an assumption here, is already sort of, your education is embodied in the internet itself, and therefore no matter what institution you were a part of, you also had a wider consciousness of other schools, and therefore sort of learning and the uniqueness of a school of thought became much more distributed horizontally. And so that is becoming more of a rarefied issue at this point. But to the extent that there are institutions and schools that are preparing you for practice, they tend to set their target on the limits of the profession as we know them today. And to the extent that there are certain institutions that do not have as their primary goal your preparation for practice, but something beyond that. And on top of that, they are seeking to prepare students conceptually for a practice that has yet to exist, or invoking the potential that you're there to change the status quo or to change the way we do things. And of course, the latter seems a little bit more satisfying in the sense that it offers the educational institution at least the possibility of agency, and that education can lead to institutional change, to professional changes, and to an expansion of the definition of what we call architectural practice. So So yes, it's education is as much as it's an opportunity, it can be hugely debilitating depending on how you frame those limits. Yes.
So if we just bring that back to the earlier question about time, to me it sometimes seems that, you know, education, architectural education, though it's giving us certain tools, it's also not quite portraying the profession as it is.
And I do not lament that. In other words,
Mhm.
let's say I'm one of those people that would argue that education was never meant to mirror the profession. It actually, they need to maintain a healthy autonomy from each other, not because they're not related to each other, but because if we were going to mirror the profession, almost you don't need to be in school. What you need to do is to go become an intern somewhere and spend 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever years in an office and and under the tutelage of someone else, gain the experience to become an architect, which was common at a certain point. No, I do think that the idea of developing schools and schools of thought was born out of the freedom of academic speculation and academic freedom at large. The idea that they're not solving merely the problems that are set forth by the various boards. In America, we have NAAB, and you know, you guys have. Do you have RIBA or is
Yeah.
RIBA is the academic one or the professional
Yeah.
one?
Well, RIBA also gives universities a
It's interesting because
accreditation.
here the professional one is NCARB, the academic one is NAAB. They're two distinct things, but they both set up different constraints and speak to each other, but they're clearly independent from each other.
One thing that you often mention is this kind of strong belief in innovation as quite a key element of, be it education, be it kind of progression within a field. And I'm just wondering whether the relationship you have with innovation somehow challenges your relationship with history and, you know, the ways we speak to history.
It's not an uninteresting question, but actually I see it. I would frame it slightly differently. I think that in great part our of our plight is against ignorance, and so our ability to expand our knowledge of history is merely the entry, the inroads into possibilities of invention or the production of new forms of knowledge. That is not that you look at history and that you emulate it necessarily, but you understand moments of social, political, or technological transition and how something came about as a way of also testing out where we are in time and how we would redefine those similar challenges. So no, in my mind, the presence of history, whether it is in the curriculum or in the consciousness of your practice as a profession, is partly the idea that you're enabling your staff, your collaborators, to have that dialogue with another generation. The anachronism I referred to earlier was precisely part of this, that you are not merely building a building right here and now. Maybe you're not building a building at all, actually. Sometimes the most intelligent moments of architecture is when you realize we should not build something here, that the conceptual program is possibly not to build. It is through adaptive reuse or through a reframing of an institution that doesn't require building. But part of that has to do with let's say, a deeper analysis of the cultural situation, and history is a central part of that. But the imperative somehow of producing new forms of knowledge is also a way of saying that that the architectural discipline is not relegated to a craft, in the sense that you don't inherit a craft, you learn its techniques, you emulate them, you perfect them, you build them, and then you pass it on to the next generation. That too is insufficient. The imperative of innovation or invention has to do with the acknowledgement that, let's say, the environmental challenges of today are distinct. Our technological hurdles are vastly different than what they were even 20 years ago, and that the way that we do things pose opportunities that require another way of thinking that doesn't tolerate merely resting on the conventions of our education 20, 30 years ago, that it requires us to remain students deep into our practice and deep into our own age, into our own generation, meaning that, in a strange way, even though I was in school in the 80s, the reason that I'm in school now is not to lead it, really. It's to be a student.
And I'm just wondering, in that appreciation of the invention of the new, whether there is a danger, this urge to always, and this drive towards the kind of new, the innovation, the never seen before, whether they can sometimes actually undermine the research.
It's important that you distinguish between the new and that which produces new forms of knowledge, if I may. The new, the idea of novelty and its association with the avant-garde of the 20th century perpetuated its own cycle of novelty that reinforced with it the consumption that happens with the desire and the need for the new. Mine is something slightly different, because the imperative of producing new forms of knowledge is a form of ideological challenge to notions of convention that we start to take for granted. Even as you look at the current pleas for curricular reform, the result of decolonization, and a plea for diversity, have to do not necessarily only for the dismantling of Western culture as we know it, but it also has to do with an expansion of the canons, a challenge to the way that canons are constructed in the first place, and the way that we conceptualize the language around what gains value and what does not. So I think the production of new forms of knowledge has a lot to do with as much the production of new things as it is to the epistemological challenge of how we give value to things in the first place. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes. In that context, what is the role of an institution as a form of authority?
Look, conservative as this may sound, I think that the school as an institution remains one of the few places where you can test out almost anything, despite all of its conservatism, or at least that's the way I would like to think of it. Part of that has to do with, in my mind, developing a leadership that is not only tolerant of difference, but is actually activist in its construction of that difference. Part of it has to do with an idea that you don't model education or practice around a persona, but rather the distinct synergies, tensions, and debates that emerge from, let's say, a curated set of voices within the body of that institution, the individuals that sort of operate between design, technology, history, theory, and representations. And so to the extent that institutions are somehow unscripted but curated debates, some of the best moments are those moments where you recognize that something happened during these years at this place. And we have different versions of that, but we know what happened at the AA under Boyarsky. We know how Cobb took back Harvard and made it into a stage of debate, and we obviously know much more about what Hayek did at Cooper, but there are these moments that instigated a good bit of polemic, and part of that had to do with the way in which the institution was built, rather than the centrality of a leadership.
But is it about exercising a form of authority, or is it about facilitating plurality?
Well, I think you hit it. You have to demonstrate the authority to facilitate that. In other words, if you can't hold the conversation together, whatever that plurality is relativism. It's dissonant voices free floating in the air. To the extent that your authority is able to bring those differences into conversation, it produces, let's say, if not clear, but at least evident choices, ideological differences, and ethical pillars. And so I do think that there's a delicate line between the authority of saying this is what we're going to do, but using that authority towards catapulting that diversity, that plurality.
So in good environments, well, I guess in education, I think it's interesting, this notion, and it's something that I think's now come up a few times in the conversations that I've had, that education, though we can often talk about it as an oppressive factor, is actually, when observed from the outside, is quite a liberating factor, and vice versa. One question that, one issue that we have in the real world is the fact that, we're paid to deliver certain kind of services, yes. Right? And I guess more and more, there are pressures on students and educational institutions in terms of delivering a service.
Yes.
So I guess Cooper Union is actually quite a fascinating example for just, the whole world of education in terms of how it sustained a free education for quite a long time. And I believe, if I understood correctly, it's trying to reestablish that.
Yes.
So yeah, what's your kind of analysis of that freedom or ability to really embrace education properly in relationship to this commodification of it?
Yeah, I actually don't see that as a commodification. I do think that there is a part of that that has to do with saying, are we or are we not going to prepare you for a profession that comes with constraints? I actually, from my perspective, no matter what you're doing, we live in a world of constraints, economic constraints, legal constraints, or urban constraints. And so I would say that Cooper is probably of the institutions the most open-ended, one of the most open-ended in its sort of wider definitions of what the students may end up doing. Some of them going into the design of software, others in politics, others in urbanism or landscape, others in graphic design even. I mean, so they will do that. I do embrace that, but at the same time, when you're in the trenches of a class or a studio, let's say housing, for instance, the housing studio, there are certain bodies of knowledge, certain histories, and certain examples that draw out some of the irreducible qualities of that terrain of knowledge that need to be unearthed. And to that end, it isn't just merely open-ended. It's also quite specific once you're in the trenches of a specific debate. To that end, probably I define a particular, as an individual, define a particular function at Cooper Union. I do practice, I do build, and I will bring some of that position to not only the reviews, but the students that want to go on in that light. The other challenge is actually how to be broad enough that you can invite other interpretations of what constitutes an architectural practice, curatorial practices, among other things, that they may go on to, because in a strange way, the cycle of making the city or making architecture sometimes requires us to educate clients as much as it is to educate architects. Once you get into the complexity of what it actually means to practice and build a building, we are required to master, if I can use that term, to become experts of such a wide range of issues, or at least become conversant with them. Forget mastery or even expertise. Imagine an architect who's not an expert in anything, but actually is conversant with a wide range of things and knows how to bring them into conversation. I think that's the most important thing. And it's just difficult. And so, if a professional education of architecture involves teaching people how to mediate, how to direct, or how to coordinate the multiplicity of things that need to be brought together, that probably also means that they can also direct a film, choreograph a complex piece of music, or run a complex company, if in fact they have the patience to learn those media in their intricate peculiarities.
Mm.
So I think that there is something about your question that has to do with um, this time, not the patience of time, but the patience of juggling many balls at the same time.
Mm. Mm. But then there is this prerogative in education that is called employability, right? Which I don't know how you, as a director of an institution or dean, deal with that
So
imposition.
no, these are all good questions. Look, it's a combination of things. And I'm in both positions at school, but also I employ people, and I don't
Yeah.
always employ well. I make mistakes too, like anybody else. But if I had to characterize the successes and failures of our employment strategies, I would say that it's a combination of two factors. One, there are a half dozen set of techniques and tools over which anybody, all of us, need to become fluent with. And broadly, they encompass drawing techniques, fabrication techniques, and writing techniques that you just need to be good at. And when I say good, you need to be fast, you need to be disciplined and rigorous and precise. And yet none of these necessarily make you a good collaborator or a good employee. So the other side of the equation has to do with people who know how to listen, people who know how to collaborate, people who have resilience, people who have a sense of humor, and people who have a sense of self to know that there's so much external to them that is probably more important than what they're working on, that they have to tap into. And so uh, the best collaborators are usually in the second group, albeit that they have a deep respect for the foundations that they need to have in order to even be eligible to enter into the game. The problem when somebody doesn't have those technical skills is that they may be great people, but they simply don't have the desire to engage in the medium of drawing or engage in the medium of writing. And so if if one were to characterize an office environment of 100, 200 people, you have specialists in all of those things. That person does detailing, that person does design, that person does writing. In a small office such as mine, you have to be ambidextrous. And therefore, each person needs to become, in some part, a mirror of this description that I'm laying down for you. This ambidextrous quality.
I mean, I do feel that in big practices, that is the major issue, is that is this kind of division of labor that is so precise that, you know, it doesn't allow for movement.
That's right.
And it blocks dialogue, really.
It does.
Among other things.
Right.
I mean, again, so this now I was going back to what I was going to ask as the very first question. The reason why I think you're in such a unique position is precisely because you practice and you are in academia, and I think this is pretty much what we've just discussed just now. And I'm just wondering that duality, being able to observe the two and being able to look in two directions, is it necessary? In a sense, what kind of institutional director would you be had you not practiced?
A very good question also, because first of all, I mean, I can't answer that without telling you that I'm an accidental academic. I mean, I was not designed to be an academic. I um, I had many challenges in school, and just getting through school was already a huge feat. And so finally, when I went on to graduate school and started teaching, is when I felt I had just started entering into an academic setting as a student. It's a very delayed reaction to learning. So it should be mentioned that that there are people who are, let's say, natural academics, and I can imagine how they don't or would not have ever required a practice in order to provide a motor for thinking within an institution. My motor has been practice through and throughout from the very beginning. And so it's almost implausible for me to make a claim to scholarship or a sort of a body of research before that. So I entered into both teaching and a position of leadership through practice. But that doesn't mean I don't enjoy or appreciate those other forms of leadership. Boyarsky did not practice. Leslie Loco doesn't practice, at least in the sense that you're posing the question. Eva Frank doesn't practice in the same way. Those are different forms of practice. Writing, curatorial practices, all are legitimate ways of building those conversations to which I referred earlier. So I do think that mine is a particular focus, but I have to say that I am, even within Cooper, I'm relatively marginal. And remember that it doesn't mean that there are not other practitioners, but there are few other practitioners. And so, and it's a small school. So if one were to appoint or put the weight of the scale on practitioners, it would really limit that conversation to which I referred earlier.
One dialogue that you carry with you is the dialogue with the construction industry. And that is something that it is quite, I mean, I'll use the word you just used, marginal in the architectural academia. We talk about many things, but we very rarely talk about construction and contractors. And, we do at certain level, like Part 3 level here in the UK, but not as part of a general discourse in the architectural academia. So what is in construction that you think we really profoundly need to understand?
There are many elements to this question, but let's try to unpack it together. First, the politics of construction has a lot to do with the evolution and the development of the city. Let's say if large cities are being motored by private investment and developers, their collaboration and their confluence with contractors is a part of that political force. So the way that municipalities, mayors, developers, and construction companies come into dialogue independent of a larger public process is something to research and be mindful of. At the same time, the relationship between construction and labor is a central part of it. The ethics behind labor on the one hand, but also the way in which each trade is categorized and each way that the trades are introduced into the protocols of this, construction are critical to this. Further to this, any contract, any construction involves a price with divisions of labor, on top of which there are general conditions as well as terms for profit. And if you do not know the economic distribution of both labor and profit making, you actually stand to become its victim. And so becoming an agent in the discussion about how we construct value, and when I say value, I'm not talking about philosophy here, I'm saying actual dollar values in the labor of building something well, and in the, it's not just the what, it's the how. It's not the brick, it's how the brick is laid, right? That we need to lay our eyes on in order to be able to become relevant in a discussion. So in part, I mean, all of these examples are ways of beginning to insert ourselves into a political process that has always been deemed external to the discipline, because it's either down the road or it's external to representation. And I do understand that the division between architecture and craft was split along those lines, that architects draw, the architects represent, our architects essentially give instructions. But I do think that we've come full circle on that. And if we do not reinsert ourselves into that process, we have missed out on huge political stakes. And so part of part of my sort of interest in that has to do with what happens in the tail end. You could say that there should be equal emphasis on the visioning of the city, the programming of the city, the urban design of it, and planning, because that is so much of what happens before you even get a commission. So who does that? Do politicians do that? Do planners do that? Do they understand the spatial and formal implications of the policies that they unleash? So I actually think that that's the other side of the same coin. That we see architecture here, we need to see it before, after, and all around to understand the implications of what we take for granted to be what our mission is, the building of buildings.
So is this the kind of knowledge that you could have only acquired through practicing?
No, indeed. I mean, at school, I mean, well, let's go back. I mean, I went to RISD for design and architecture. I went to AA for history and theory, and that was very instrumental to at least kind of opening up my mind to the sort of social and political context within which architecture happens. But when I went to Harvard, I was in urbanism, in the urban design department. So already within the context of academia, I was beginning to poke holes at architecture from those externalities. I do think construction had a lot to do with this, because I graduated from RISD at a time when the economy was good, and we got 2 or 3 commissions ourselves without practicing in another firm. So without any experience, we were dove deep into a pool of practice and learned our lessons the hard way. But by entering into the politics of construction through these 3 small houses that we built, we also learned very quickly that the mistakes that we were making, or the questions we were posing, were miscalibrated because of such and such reasons. And so that also changed the way that we framed our relationship to practice. And that, in great part, that's how we brought practice back into academia.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting, you often make that in a couple of lectures I've seen, you often make that connection to the economy and how at what point of economy did you enter education, and at what point did you, get commissioned, start work, etc.?
Well, I'm mindful of that because remember, the previous generation had no work and they had the time to think. And a lot of the so-called inventions of postmodernism were happening in an economic vacuum. I'm also mindful of the younger generation that entered practice about 10, 15 years ago that were riding the wave of certain developmental sort of thrusts and economic booms that were happening. I'm speaking about let's say the Bjarke Engels generation, right? And many who may have otherwise been interested in academia or in broader research went directly into practice because that was an opportunity. So none of these are automatic nor natural. They are both externally driven by opportunities out there, but also internally decided based on what is the type of practice you want to be.
But I think it was a really fascinating remark that you made about getting those 3 architecture school jobs at the basically peak of the previous recession.
Yes. Yes.
Where you decided not to have redundancies in your practice, but actually invest that capital, that kind of human capital, into competitions that then materialize in 3 projects, even though it was a kind of peak of a recession.
Right.
And, we don't need to talk about that, but I think maybe to conclude, we could talk about this recession, which is I just read in some British newspaper that it was the worst recession since 1709, which is
that right?
Yeah, at least in Britain. So what are those lessons from these kind of moments of economic failure that we need to embrace, or that you feel may result from this new condition that we find ourselves in?
Well, let's go back to what's happened in the last 12 months. We have benefited from the state financial help to keep us afloat on 2 different occasions, not just once. We have held the team together for over 9 months and then lost half of the team subsequently. These are the realities and the casualties of this period. But in addition to the normative things that we would have needed to do, that is to complete the buildings that were underway and the projects, we were on the tail end of most of those projects. So we had to invent new things without which everybody would have been sitting idle. So the completion of one book and the inauguration of another book took a lot of time to do, one of which should be coming out in the coming month or 2. The other one, which will still take another year to do, has been the sweat of this period, and what it means to build an argument. What does it mean to not so much compile a document of projects and then do a monograph around them, but what does it mean to build an argument that merely includes part of those projects in their dialogue with history, which is a different approach to building that second book. So those are important. Second, as you may know, that 50% of our practice is in the design studio, but the other 50 is in the construction studio below it. And so translating a lot of the work that we were doing into design build and shifting our financial efforts into delivering on some of the things that we may not have been competitive for in a different economy, all of a sudden enabled us to build out certain things that made us survive further, but also through research in developing prototypes for the Venice Biennale, as well as some projects that we're doing, have opened up a new avenue for what it is that we do in general. So it's not only collaborating with other trades, but actually is sort of instigating and undertaking those tasks ourselves. But also a deep reflection about what is it that we actually do in an office as each individual. What are the expertise we require, and how do we need to expand, and how do we re-educate our staff? Meaning, how do you teach people how to write? How do you teach people how to draw? How do you teach people how to build? These are things we take for granted, but drawing in pencil, CAD, Rhino, and Revit are 4 different things, and using this time productively means to develop that studio into an educational platform. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing over the last 12 months is to develop platforms of learning so that people understand that now that we are fewer people, we also have to learn to do more and be more versatile. But which I think will pay off, not because we'll survive for the next 6 months, we'll actually practice differently going into the future.
What forms of expertise emerged as a required or as something that was needed?
Well, look, there is a generational divide around digital production, and so making sure that that everybody can think integratively through Revit, even though Revit is not great for modeling and for thinking through a design problem. You need to sort of straddle that line productively, and so that's been one. I would say that researching and writing has been a large part of this, believe it or not, both in school and out of school. You don't have access to libraries in the traditional sense. We all have our own libraries, but they're limited, let's say. But finding the right books, finding the right information, finding where they're applicable, and building the narrative for this client or for this exhibition or for this interview is a great part of telling the architectural story. I mean, there's a version of architectural practice that says we actually don't do anything. We just tell stories. And but telling that story requires research and some inquiry to build that narrative. And so that's certainly something we've done on more than one occasion and benefited from, because we've, while we haven't, gained many jobs during the last 9 months, we've survived by gaining access to a handful of them. They're modest, but they are critical for advancing ourselves. And so that's been part of it also.
And if we observe this last year as quite a paradigm shifting time, if we compare it to the closest historical event of similar magnitude, which perhaps was the Second World War, on that kind of global scale, what followed that event in the 1940s was modernism and everything that kind of emerged from it. So, I'm not trying to ask whether you see a potential for an emergence of new form of thinking, but what do you see potentially?
This may sound like a cliche, but I think it's already happened. The question is to what degree this becomes institutionalized. So online education is nothing new, but the idea that online education was the only thing to which the world had access to was nothing that they had actually pondered even a year ago. And so going forward, be prepared for hybrid learning as an institutional de facto, that those things that they can do online productively, or in their words, productively or more effectively, they will do that because it will save a lot of money. Opening up the debate for what is it that we do better in person and how much of it is necessary, and to what degree does that rely on the real estate that defines the capital campaigns of the various campuses that you know, define the ethos of, you know, the Harvards, the MITs, and the, you know, Berkeleys, right? The physical place is an important part of it. That's certainly part of it. From a broader perspective, the idea that you know, the body and its health have become central to the policing of individuals and nations is an added element to your passport. It's no longer the name, the origin, the nationality. It is the kind of the inner workings of that body and what it's transmitting. That be prepared for an unprecedented access to the information within. And I would say that the corollary to that, is, of course, is the radical emergence of the new online economies, from Amazon to other things that have essentially killed other economies, will instigate a revision of how we see the city because of, you know, what constitutes the main street and the urbanism that would have thrived as a result of it, will also pose questions about the necessity of the mall, the main street, the shopping center. And so we stand to see shifts in how we conceptualize the city in great part.
But those are,
Go ahead.
those are quite formal changes. I'm wondering whether it's the formal changes that will lead to changes of consciousness, or there are also some kind of changes of consciousness that have happened and that will emerge.
Yeah, no, I do think that these are actually changes of consciousness. So the formalities of online education have to do with the once and for all dismantling of the uniqueness of schools of thought, and the question about what constitutes the need for and access to this particular institution or that one. And I do think that those are, let's say, what interests me is not the consciousness nor the form of it, but the relationship between the two. And I would say that more broadly about the discipline of architecture. It's not the form nor the ideas, it's the connection between words and figures, you know, words and forms. So what interests me in your question is how specific physical limitations, the distancing of two individuals by 6 feet or more, has resulted in a transformation of consciousness. But I think that, you know, the role that data is playing in our lives today, the role that the individual body in the collective plight that we all face together, and all of the things that stand to transform the institutions that we know, are very